All right, so you finished your sculpture and it's time to think about like what you want to do for the surface. So before you address the surface, the most important thing is to make sure that you've finished up any rough edges. So if I look around and I can see places like this would be something that would need what's called a beauty coat. And so that is where you're putting one final layer. It doesn't have to cover the entire sculpture, but in that one area, really putting down your last layer of paper mache to seal that up so you don't have those little gaps, because that will become more apparent when you are done. So ideally you want to use something called gesso, and that just creates a really nice base layer for painting. Not everybody's going to have this, so if you have gesso, great. Finish your beauty coat, let your piece dry, and then just paint right over it with your gesso. You might need 2 layers depending on how dark perhaps your paper mache is. But if you don't have that, maybe you just have acrylic or another type of paint, right? You could use paint as well. I have used house paint in the past. Right, so there's nothing wrong with a good old can of house paint. The only thing is because those already have like a gloss or semi-gloss coat, it is harder to get paint to stick to it when you do, if you're trying to paint over it, right? So keep that in mind, that it might affect how well your paint goes down on top. Gesso is great because it's made to have a little bit more of a grip to it for that exact reason, so that it will allow paint to be applied on top of it. I think I mentioned before, but you could also just use actual paper in a neutral tone. So this is like a gray, it's basically gray newspaper that comes sometimes in packaging instead of, say, bubble wrap. Sometimes you'll also get it in a brown color, or I've seen other tones as well. So you could use that, or I've even seen people use construction paper, right? So if you wanted, say, a bright blue piece and you had blue construction paper, you could even use that. But I could also basically paper mache my last layer, or 2 layers depending, with my kind of neutral single tone paper. That way I'm not wasting a large amount of this paper for the structure. I'm just using it in the high value areas of the last kind of portion, right? You could also, I've seen people use joint compound. This is what you use to patch walls. This can be used, and it can be kind of nice because once it dries, you can actually sand it. So you can see that I actually took my brush and I started to brush it on here. Of course, make sure that if you're using this, that whoever it belongs to in your home knows that you're using it, and that's all right. But you could brush this on and then let it dry, and like I said, you'd probably want to sand it, and it's actually really great for that. So you could really fill in a lot of areas and not quite sculpt with it, but use it really the way it's supposed to be used, which is to fill in gaps, and then sand it, and then you could also go ahead and paint with it as well. All right, I wouldn't advise spray paint just because that involves, you know, having to make sure you have a well-ventilated area, having a mask, you know, all of those kind of precautions. So I would use that as like my last choice, and it has the same challenge as house paint in that you can't paint as easily over it because it usually has that glossy layer, right? So those are your top choices for adding a neutral base before you apply any color, whether it's with paint or something else. Gesso is your first bet. Neutral pieces of paper are your second next bet. Some sort of white paint would be great as well.